Pawns are the soul of chess. This quote comes from Francois Andre Philidor, one of the greatest chess players of the 18th century. He was right. More chess games are decided by pawn, the way you play your pawn, than by any tactic or combination. Today, we learn everything about how pawns work. There are four important pawn types you must know. The first one is the passed pawn. A passed pawn, a pawn that has no enemy's pawn blocking its path. No enemy's pawn, no enemy's piece blocking its path to the other side of the board. Not in front of it and not on the adjacent files. A passed pawn is considered a future queen. Its value increases with every square it advances. In the endgame, a passed pawn is often the deciding factor. Every chess player's dream is a protected passed pawn on the sixth or seventh rank. It is almost always a winning advantage. In this situation, this pawn on d5 is considered a passed pawn. There is no pawn behind it, there is no pawn in front of it, no enemy's pawn in front of it, and no pawn at the adjacent side, either on e5, e6 or c6. So this pawn is considered a passed pawn because it has passed through the enemy and is now ready to progress and get to become a queen or any other important piece. So the pawn on d5 is considered a passed pawn. The second pawn type we are going to look at is what we consider the doubled pawn. The doubled pawn. In this situation, a doubled pawn or doubled pawns, they are considered a weakness for you. They cannot defend each other because they are lining on a vertical line. The rear pawn is blocking the other pawn and is preventing it from advancing. So in this situation, we have a pawn on c6 and another pawn on c7. This pawn on c6 is blocking the movement on the pawn on c7. So this is what we consider a double pawn. So this pawn on c7 cannot move forward unless the pawn on c6 moves forward. So this is considered a weakness in this situation. So and it is very easy for your opponent to attack because these pawns are not working hand in hand. They are not working together. So one is preventing the other and it is easy for your opponent to attack these pawns. So you have to try to avoid creating a double or creating doubled pawns in your own position. When it is possible, create them in your opponent's position. Try as much as possible to make sure your opponent has a double pawn than you creating a double pawn or double pawns for your own game. It is a weakness whenever you have double pawns in your game. The next set of pawn we are going to look at is what we considered an isolated pawn. An isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is a pawn with no friendly pawns on either adjacent file. What we consider a friendly pawn is your own pawns, your own other pawns. In this situation, the pawn on c5 and the pawn on a7 are considered isolated pawns. Why are they isolated pawns? When you look at the adjacent side behind them or in front of them, right? These pawns do not have any friendly pawns. There is no pawns in all of these squares that I've highlighted. Same thing with the pawn on a7 as well. There is no pawn in all of these places I've highlighted because this pawn will serve as a protection or something they are protecting. So when a pawn is standing alone, compare with this pawn that has a pawn in front of it and even has one behind it. So in this case, this particular pawn on f6 is protecting the one on e5 and is being protected by the one on g7. So this here is what we have, is where we have the isolated pawn. It does not have any support. It must be defended by pieces. There are no pawns to support it, so you only use the other pieces to defend it. So this means the opponent can attack the isolated pawn and force your pieces into a very passive and defensive positions, right? So when you have an isolated pawns where it is not being defended by other pawns, you try to make use of your other pieces like your rook, your bishop, and your knight to defend the pawn to ensure that your opponent does not capture it. So in that case, that piece you are using to defend the isolated pawn is not at its full potential. That is not where it is supposed to be. You shouldn't be defending a pawn, right? So that is what your opponent has made you to be. So in most situations, you want to try to avoid isolated pawns. You don't want your pawns or your pawns to be working in isolation, right? There should be like some connections between your pawns. So that is going to create what we call a protection for your pawns, so that there won't be a way where your opponent will, will capture your pawn, or you will now need to defend your pawn with a bigger piece. So the last set of pawn that we are going to talk about is what we call the backward pawn. The backward pawn. Remember we mentioned about a pawn where there is when we are talking about isolated pawn, but we mentioned that a pawn is not isolated when there is like a pawn at the adjacent square, right? In this case, the pawn on B4 is not isolated because it is defended by the pawn on C5, the black pawn in this case, right? So in this case, this particular pawn on D6 is the last pawn that is defending the one on C5, right? So is there any pawn either on E7 or C7 defending this last pawn? No, in this case. So this pawn on D6 is considered a backward pawn because in the chain of pawns, in terms of pawns defending pawns, it is the last one that does not have any defense, that doesn't have any pawn that is defending it, right? A pawn that cannot advance safely, and has no friendly pawns behind it, on the adjacent, files, they are considered a backward pawn. That means they don't have any support. So the next thing we are going to talk about is what we call the pawn chain. The pawn chain. A pawn chain is a diagonal line of connected pawns. A pawn chain is a diagonal line of connected pawns. Diagonal line of connected pawns. So if we look at these pawns on B2, C3, D4, and E5, this is a pawn chain. It is a diagonal line of connected pawns. You can see that these pawns are connected. One is defending the other, and so on like that. Same thing with the black pawns as well. We have a connected pawn and a pawn chain here. We also have another pawn chain in this situation. So this is what we call a pawn chain. The pawn at the back is the base of the chain, right? And that is what we call the backward pawn. Like the last one at the back is the base of the pawn of the chain, and the one at the top is the front of the chain. And the base is the most important pawn, right? The base pawn is the most important one. It's the one holding everything together. The other pawns defend each other, all the way to the chain, right? When we look at it, in this case, we have pawns defending one another. This is defending this is defending this. In fact, this base here is defending the one at the top. So this pawn on B2 is considered the most important pawn in this chain because one, it is not defended by anything, and when this particular pawn goes off, every other one goes off, because when this one is off the board in this case, then it is easy, there won't be anything protecting this one as well. It is easy to get captured. Same thing with this one on D4 and then E5, and then all of the chain is broken, right? So this base pawn on B2 is the most important pawn in a pawn chain, right? The base pawn is considered the most important pawn. So in order, when you want to attack a pawn chain, right, attack it from the base. If you want to attack a pawn chain, attack it from the base, and then from that point you can start capturing upward, right? And if you want to capture the base pawn, and when the base pawn is captured, the entire chain is broken. So if you attack only from the front, there is like a line of defense. That's why it is called a chain. And then all of the pawn chains are defending one another, right? So this is one of the most important strategic principles you want to learn in chess. When you see a pawn chain, find the base and attack from the base. When you attack from the base, then you've broken the pawn chain and you are good to go. So, and when you have a pawn chain in your own game, try to avoid your opponent attacking you from the base or attacking the pawn chain from the base. Then you save your game. The next thing we are going to talk about when it comes to pawn is what we call pawn breaks. A pawn break is when you advance a pawn to open the position or challenge your opponent's pawn structure. Let's look at this particular position to understand my explanation. Again, a pawn break is a situation where you advance your pawn to open a position or challenge your opponent's pawn structure, right? When your opponent has a pawn chain, or when your opponent has a particular pawn structure, but you want to open it up, you want to challenge it in order to break that chain or to break the structure, then you have what we call pawn breaks. So this particular pawn on B2 is considered a pawn break. Let's look at this structure here and this structure of your own pawn here, right? If you look at this situation here, it is impossible for white pawns on c4, d5, and then e4 to advance because they are being blocked by unfriendly pawns, by the black pawns. So it is impossible for this pawn to advance forward. So in order for you to do that, you can play a move like this, b4. This b4 is considered a pawn break because after black captures like this, then it has created a path for the pawn on c4 to advance forward, right? Now this pawn on c4 is ready to advance to c5. So without that move, without this pawn break to b4, it is not possible. Same thing, we have a pawn break here as well on the f file. So if you play a move like this and this gets captured, you have another pawn break because now this structure is broken by white. After this black capture f4, you can push your pawn forward, and now the pawn that was here preventing this pawn on e4 moving forward has moved to f4, and then you can move forward to e5, and start attacking. So that is the typical example of a pawn break, right? So a pawn break it's a way to turn what we call a closed position. A closed position is when everything is like occupied, there's no way for your pieces to move around, and it is like very static, right? So if you want to do that, you use a pawn break. It's a tactical game, right? Where you push your pawn and break a pawn structure from your opponent's perspective, and then you have what we called a pawn break, and then you can advance your own pawn. So what you want to do is you want to try as much as possible to always look out for pawn breaks in your positions. Whenever you have a position, take a look at this position I'm showing you right now. Whenever you have a position like this, so first thing you want to do is that, oh, this is a close position, right? All of the places your pieces can go to are very, very limited, right? These pawns are doing a lot of job. So you want to break it, right? You want to break this position so you can advance one. In case you break this position, your rook become open and a lot of things become possible, right, in this position. So when you have a position, or when you are playing a game, you try to look for pawn breaks in your position and try to push your pawn, break the structure of your opponent's pawn. And you should always ask yourself the question, which pawn move will open lines for my pieces, right? Which pawn move is going to create a direct path for my bishop? Which pawn move is going to open a file for my rook? So all of these questions will make you observe and see some pawn breaks in your game. And then you can also ask which pawn move will challenge my opponent's strongest pawn, right? Which is the base pawn in most cases, which I have explained. So that is what your pawn break is going to be. That particular pawn move that answer these questions is what your pawn break is going to be. So let's move on. The next thing we are going to talk about is what we call majority and minority pawns. Pawn majorities and pawn minorities. A pawn majority is when you have more pawns than your opponent on one side of the board. It is when you have more pawns than your opponent on one side of the board. The board is usually divided into two sides. Whenever you arrange your board and you set up your board, the side where your king is considered the king side, and the other side where your queen is considered the queen side, right? So this is the queen side for white, this is the king side for black. This is the king side for black, this is the queen side for white. So when you have more pawns at either side of these boards, then you have what we call pawn majority, and then your opponent will have pawn minorities. So let's take a look at this particular side, this queen side first. White has how many pawns? 3 pawns, right? And each of these 3 pawns is ready to advance forward. In this case, and black has how many? 2 pawns ready to advance as well. So from this queen side perspective, white is said to have pawn majorities and black has pawn minorities. Whereas let's look at this other king side. Black has how many pawns? 4 pawns, and white has how many pawns? 3 pawns. So white is said to have pawn minorities at the king side, and then black is said to have pawn majorities at the king side. So if you have 3 pawns against your opponent, two pawns on the queen side, you have a queen side majority, and you can advance these pawns, create a pass pawn, and you promote to become a queen. And when you have a pawn minority, right, that is when you advance fewer pawns against your opponent more pawns, right? It is not to promote most times, so it is just for you to create weakness in your opponent's pawn structure, right? You know that you don't have a chance. Your opponent has more majority pawns at any side of the board than you, but you are advancing those pawns in order to break the structure of your opponent's pawns, or in order to create a weakness around it. So the most important end game principle you want to know is that convert your pawn majority into a pass pawn. When you have more pawns at any side of the board, convert it into a pass pawn, and then you push it to become a queen. When you advance it and it becomes a queen, the game becomes very simple for you. So this is simple in concept, right? It is simple to say, but it is very difficult in execution. So that is why you need to practice, especially end game positions when you have different pawn structures. And that is why you have to follow the different types of pawns that I've mentioned above. You don't want to mess it up. You don't want the ones that are weaknesses, you want to avoid them. And the ones that are very solid, you want to use them in your games. So remember, pawns are the soul of chess. They are not weak. They are not weak. Know these 4 types of pawns. The pass pawn, that is your best friend in the end game. Whenever you have an end game, the pass pawn is your best friend. You can easily push it forward, you get a queen, and you quickly checkmate the game. And then you have the doubled pawn, which is a weakness, and you need to avoid it. You need to avoid the double pawns because it prevents you from moving forward, and it is like very easy for your opponent to attack. And isolated pawns are very easy to attack, and they are very hard to protect. So you want to also avoid isolated pawns because it is very difficult to attack. Most times you will have to use a bigger piece to protect it, or a bishop to protect it, or a rook to protect it, or any other piece at all to protect it. And that is going to be a little bit hard for you to do that. And then we have the backward pawn, which is like a pawn that is stuck and very, very vulnerable, which is like the base of your pawn structure. So when you have a backward pawn, you try as much as possible to not allow your opponent to to take it or to capture it, because that means all of the chain will become broken. And when you see your opponent having a backward pawn, you find a way, or a backward pawn, find a way to capture the pawn so that you'll be able to break your opponent's pawn chain or pawn structure. Another thing is you should try to attack the base of a pawn chain. Use pawn breaks to open the position and create a pass pawn so that you can merge it to become or to promote it into any piece you want. Tomorrow, we are going to learn about the London system, one of the most reliable and easiest to learn openings for white. It is used for white, the London system. And if you are a beginner, this is an opening you really want to learn. Subscribe, and I will see you then.